Alright, so let's get this video started. Welcome to Bio 100. And right now I'd like to talk about the meaning of life. By which I kind of mean the literal meaning of life. What is life? Right? So, biology is the study of life. It comes from Greek, bio, meaning life, logi, meaning to study. So then the next question is, what is life? What sorts of things are alive? And biologists study all sorts of living things. Biologists study very big things, very small things, and even microscopic things like bacteria. Biologists sometimes study individual organisms, like the biology of a person, or a plant, or an animal. Biologists can also study parts of living things. My personal field is cell and molecular biology. So my primary study is what goes on inside cells and how molecules and proteins inside cells how molecules and proteins inside cells interact with one another to give life its characteristics. And so you can even study tiny, minuscule parts of cells like DNA and proteins. This is where I tend to live. But biology isn't just the study of, like, cellular organisms or like the fluidy, gooey bits of things. The behavior of organisms is just as much a part of biology. So here we have a little bird of paradise doing its little crazy mating dance. Biologists can also study how organisms live together in an ecosystem. This is the field of ecology or environmental biology. How groups and populations of organisms interact with one another, predator-prey relationships, how they exchange materials with the environment. And you can study how organisms change over time. Mostly as groups and in the context of an environment. So this would be evolutionary biology. In biology, there are some general themes. Life is a big one. Life is the central theme of biology. And it's actually kind of difficult to define. Like you would think, everyone thinks that they have a very good concept of life, and honestly, most people probably do. But if you try to explain what life is to someone who didn't really know, it's actually very complicated because life finds a way. Life exists in so many different forms that, like, for almost any rule for life that you can come up with, there are exceptions to it. There's only very, very few things that we can say all living things have. But there are a few traits that all living things have. And you kind of like have to have these traits in order to qualify as a living thing. So first off, order. Right? Now, not everything that is ordered is alive. Crystals are ordered. Cars are ordered. But they're very much not alive. But all living things are ordered, and they maintain their order through a process called homeostasis. And homeostasis is the ability of living things to maintain their internal order. You can even sort of say that once things stop having homeostasis, once things stop being able to maintain their internal order, that's kind of what defines death. Next is regulation. And basically this means control. The ability to control one's own internal environment. So this is also related to homeostasis. Regulation could be the ability to control one's internal temperature, to control one's internal hormonal state, energy usage, all sorts of things like that. But the ability to control one's internal state is regulation. Growth and development. All living things grow. And sometimes they don't necessarily get bigger when they grow, but they can always replenish themselves. And all living things change over time. That's what development is. You might start off as a baby or as a fertilized egg, an embryo, and you go through many, many changes as you go through life. This is true even for very simple things like bacteria or yeast or stuff like that. Even though we might not be able to see the changes that go on in them, on the inside, they're actually changing quite a bit from when they are born to when they, usually reproduce into two new things. Energy processing, right? There ain't no free lunch. If you're going to maintain your own internal order, if you're going to grow and develop, if you're going to regulate yourself, if you're going to do any of the other things that are coming up on this list, all of that takes energy. And so all living things process energy. You have to get energy from somewhere and be able to use it. Some things get energy from the light of the sun. This is called photosynthesis. But many things get energy from, basically other living things that they eat. Or sometimes even non-living things that they eat. Response to the environment. All living things have to be able to get information from their environment and react to that. Nothing is truly passive in the world of life. Even things that we think of as being very inert, that we don't think of as having free will or anything like that, like say this Venus flytrap here, this does respond to the environment. When this bug lands on it, it's going to shut its trap and capture it. And non-predatory plants are the same way. You might think that trees and grasses don't respond to the environment, but they do. Plants grow to face the sun. As the sun moves throughout the course of the day, they're going to shift the tilt of their leaves in order to capture the most amount of light on it. They will, many plants will produce flowers or fruits only during certain parts of the year, and they do that based off of the temperature of their surrounding area or the length of the light cycle, and these are how plants tell when it's time to flower and when it's time to fruit and when it's time to lose your leaves and go dormant for a while. So even very, very simple things like bacteria respond to the environment. It might be something as simple as like if there is sugar, then they're going to make proteins that will take the sugar inside and use it for energy. If the environment is harsh, then they're going to try to get away from that. But all living things respond to the environment in some way. Reproduction. All living things reproduce somehow. It's really kind of a part of growth and development. The very simplest organisms are just a single cell, and those reproduce just usually by splitting in half, a process called binary fission. But more complicated organisms, plants, fungi, animals, multicellular organisms have very complicated reproductive cycles. Anything from growing and germinating a seed, sporulation, or the development of an embryo from an egg. But like, while it's possible for something that is alive to not reproduce, eventually everything dies. And if you don't reproduce, then when you die, you stop existing. There's nothing forward into the future. So anything that doesn't reproduce, we don't really have any records of it. The one thing that we can say about every living thing is that we are all the product of organisms that reproduced. And evolution. Evolution means the change of an organism over time. We're usually not talking about the change of an individual organism, like, you work out, you get stronger, stuff like that. That falls under growth and development. What we're talking about is the change of a species, typically, or even of parts of a species over time, right? Usually in big groups. And you don't necessarily have to look at entire organisms. You can look at molecular evolution. You can look at just a small piece of organisms, like a single gene. And you can ask yourself, how did that gene change over time? But you have to be looking at it in a large number of creatures. Evolution always involves large numbers. Or at the very least, medium numbers of organisms. And all living things, all living species, evolve and change over time in response to the environment, and also sometimes just randomly. And this is a byproduct of the fact that biology is not perfect. While we reproduce, none of us just grow clones of ourselves. Even bacteria, that theoretically that's what they're trying to do, they're imperfect. Which means that even when they try to make an exact copy of themselves, they're going to get a few things wrong. And when that happens, you get diversity. You get different organisms with different capabilities that will be more or less successful in the world. When the change in an organism is driven by the ability of that organism to succeed in reproducing itself, we call that natural selection. But natural selection isn't the only force of evolution. Some evolution is driven purely by random chance, what's called genetic drift, and founder effects, And these are all things that we will talk about later on in the class. So the next big theme is organization. All life, by its nature, is organized. Remember, order was the first quality that I brought up on that list. And there's different ways that you can talk about life being organized. On one sense, organization is the ability to, your internal organization, how the organism is structured, that you've got like a brain, the brain is in your head, you've got hearts, you've got muscles, you've got kidney, you've got liver, these things are all made out of tissues, those tissues are made out of cells, and yada, yada, yada. You could make an argument that this order is what separates living things from non-living things. Things like rocks don't maintain their internal order at all. Dead things don't maintain their internal order anymore. That's what makes them dead. But we can also talk about the organization of life in terms of how we talk about them and how we categorize life. This is an organization that we impose on the world around us. Living things don't actually care about like species or, phylum or what kingdom they're in or things like that. These aren't concepts of the living world. These are concepts of humans, but they're concepts that we use to organize our thoughts about the living world. If we're getting into the organization of life, I want to start at the very largest and then go to the very smallest. The very largest level of organization is the biosphere itself, and that is the Earth, everything that lives on the Earth, right? The entire community of life. And all of the interactions and behavior of those communities working together, preying upon one another, everything like that. So that's the very largest organization. Next, we have ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a unified geographical area and all of the things that live within that area. And it also specifically includes the non-living things that interact. So let's say we're talking about a lake. A lake would be an ecosystem. And it includes all of the fish that live in the lake, all of the insects that the fish eat, the bacteria and algae that grow in the lake, and it also includes things like the water, right? Water isn't alive, but you need water to live. You need water to live, and it also includes the nutrients that you are, dredging up, that all of the plants are using to grow and things like that. It includes the oxygen in the air and the nitrogen as well, all of the minerals that living things need. So all of those things together make up an ecosystem. A community is similar to an ecosystem, but does not include all of the non-living things. So a community would be all of the living things that are in an area. So the community of a lake might include the fish and the algae and the insects and the other invertebrates that are around, but would not include the air and the water and the nutrients. When we talk about ecosystems, we're mostly talking about how resources, like those non-living resources, get into organisms. When we're talking about communities, we're often talking about interactions between different groups. Like maybe you have a forest that has oaks and squirrels and wolves in it. I mean, it's probably going to have more than those three things, but let's talk about those three things right now. So, like, the oaks grow and produce acorns. The squirrels are going to eat the acorns, and then the wolves are going to prey upon the squirrels. So when we're talking about communities, we're usually talking about how do the oaks and the squirrels interact. Well, if you've got more oaks, then you can support a larger number of squirrels. How do the squirrels and the wolves interact? Well, so the more squirrels there are, the faster the wolf population can grow. But if the wolf population grows too large, they're going to start killing off all the squirrels. The squirrel population will shrink, and then some of the wolves will starve and die off, right? So we're talking about how groups of living things interact with one another. Populations are those groups of living things. So a population is all one species in an area, but we're just talking about the one species. So if we were to take our forest example, we could talk about the population of squirrels, or we could talk about the population of oaks. And if we're looking at a population level, then usually what we're going to be paying attention to is what's called population dynamics. How fast do they reproduce? How fast does the population grow? How fast does the population shrink? And also migration between different groups, right? So are the squirrels from this forest going and joining squirrels in a different forest? So that's out migration. And are squirrels from another forest coming into this population? That would be in migration. And next level down after population is looking at the organism itself. If you're an organismal biologist, now you're starting to just look at one thing at a time, right? If you are a human biologist, by which I mean a biologist who studies humans, not one who is a human. Hopefully most biologists are human. But if you study humans, then you're going to be interested in how the whole organism operates. So this field is going to be very close to like medicine and stuff like that. We're looking at anatomy, we're looking at physiology. How is the organism put together so that the organism functions? And the organismal level, is kind of where everything comes together, right? Populations are made of organisms. But you can divide a population into organisms, and the organisms are free living. You can also subdivide organisms. You can look at just parts of the organism, but those parts are usually not capable of living on their own. So, for instance, you can look at organs and organ systems. You could look at the respiratory system. If you are a pulmonologist, you study human respiratory systems. If you are a reproductive biologist, you study the reproductive system, right? You could be a cardiologist, in which you study the heart primarily. And then those organs themselves are made out of tissues. Tissues are groups of similar cell types. So, for instance, the muscle in your heart is a type of tissue called cardiac muscle. Um, the your skin, the upper layer of your skin, your epidermis, is made of a type of tissue called epithelial tissue, which is very good for coating things. So that's a level of organization. It is below organs and organ systems. Organs are made out of tissues. Organisms are made out of organs and organ systems all working together. And then below tissues, we have cells. And cells would be the next big unifying concept. The cell is the smallest free living structure. So like you could take one cell from my body, say a skin cell, and you could keep it alive, and it could make more skin cells. Now, it's never going to grow into a human, I hope, but you could keep it alive, and it could reproduce. But anything smaller than a cell isn't really alive. It's just a piece of a living thing. But cells themselves, just like organisms are made of organs and organ systems, cells have inside of them organelles. These organelles are small internal structures that perform specific tasks, similar to how, like, your heart pumps your blood, your stomach digests your food. Cells have these internal structures that do specialized tasks for them. At least some cells do, some cells don't. And then these organelles themselves are built out of molecules and atoms. Things like protein, lipids, DNA. And you can be a biologist and you can study any of these levels. You probably don't study all of them. You might study more than one. So if you are like a biologist who studies ecosystems, you are probably a ecologist. And you might study ecosystems and communities of life, together. If you're a population biologist, you're studying how the populations of a particular organisms change, the interactions between members of that species, mating interactions, fighting interactions, competition, things like that. And the same, you have biologists who study organisms, biologists who study organs and organ systems, biologists who study and focus on cells. There isn't really a biologist who specifically focuses on organelles, right? That's kind of included in the study of cells. And so, like, for me, as a cell and molecular biologist, I live kind of in this realm. I have a good friend who is an ecologist. He studies lake ecologies. And so he studies basically here, from ecosystems down to populations. But somebody who's like more of a doctor or a physiologist would probably do most of their work in that category, looking at organisms and the larger structures that make up organisms. In addition to that type of organization, like the organization of, inherent to human life or to any sort of life, there's also the way we organize our thoughts about these things, how we group them together into things like species and, what the relations between those species are. Like, these are fish, those are, apes, something like that. So we put life into different organized categories depending upon shared characteristics. And this study, the study of how we as humans categorize living things, is called taxonomy. There are, in the most common taxonomic system, 3 domains of life. These are the very largest categories that we group things into. And they are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Probably everything that you have ever seen is in this category, eukarya. All multicellular life, humans, plants, animals, fungi, and even a lot of unicellular life that's relatively complicated, like many algae and amoebas and things like that, those are all eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are relatively complicated. They have large, complex cells that have lots of specialized organelles in them. And we call these things eukaryotes. I might have spelled that wrong. Eu means true. Karyo means, in this circumstance, nucleus. And so these are organisms that have a true nucleus. Bacteria and archaea are both what we call prokaryotes, meaning that they are single-celled organisms that don't have a nucleus. And so, like, when I was in, grade school and junior high, this domain, actually domains didn't exist. And this, archaea, we were just beginning to discover them. Archaea look like bacteria, meaning they're really, really tiny. You got to use a microscope to look at them. They mostly look like little dots or little lines. And so for a long time, we thought that all of the archaea were just bacteria. But we discovered that even though they look very similar, on the inside, they actually work very, very differently. In fact, we discovered that archaea, these weird bacteria-looking things, in some ways are more similar to humans than they are to bacteria. Certain things about how we make proteins and stuff like that are more similar between us and archaea. So at that point, it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to classify them together, so we had to separate them out into different domains. So collectively, bacteria and archaea are the prokaryotes, because they don't have a nucleus, but they bacteria and archaea, though they might look very, very similar, have different traits going on inside of them that I'll address in a second. So the kingdom Eukarya, or the domain Eukarya, includes several kingdoms. Plantae, which is the plants, fungi, which is the fungi, Animalia, which is the animals, and Protista, which is kind of a grab bag category. All of the things that don't really fit into the other three usually get stuffed into Protista. But what Protista all has in common is that they're all single-celled. So Protista is things like amoebas, and paramecia, and all of the single-celled eukaryotes. Whereas plants, fungi, animals, usually multicellular. The multicellular kingdoms, plants, fungi, animals, are divided by how they get food, or how they get their energy. Plants produce their own sugars by using the sun through a process of photosynthesis. Fungi are not plants. I know you find them in the produce section with a whole bunch of other plants in Walmart or whatever, but they are not plants. They are actually closer related to animals than they are to plants. But they're primarily what are called decomposers. They live on dead matter, and they secrete digestive enzymes into the world around them, and things get digested outside of the fungi, and then the fungi absorbs the digested materials. So digestion is like, they don't eat things so much as they just wait for them to break apart and then slurp up all of the little pieces. Animals usually obtain food by ingesting and digesting other organisms. We actually eat food, right? And whether those other organisms are plants, like, say, corn, or other animals, like, I don't know, squirrels or cows or whatever, in either way, we're getting our nutrients by actually taking some piece of another organism into ourselves, breaking it down, digesting it internally, and then allowing those nutrients into the rest of our body. So here we have the two prokaryotic domains, eukarya with its 4 kingdoms. So ecosystems. As I mentioned before, an ecosystem is the geographic area, or a unified geographic area, all of the organisms that live inside of it, and all of the non-living things that they interact with, that they either produce and put out into the world, like we breathe out carbon dioxide, or that they ingest and incorporate into themselves, like we might, drink water, and breathe in oxygen and things like that. So all of the living organisms in a specific area, along with all of the non-living factors that they interact with, form an ecosystem. There are 2 main processes that ecosystems depend on, right? The flow of energy is a very important one. All ecosystems have at their base what are called primary producers. You see, no matter how efficient you are, anytime you eat something, you're never going to use 100% of the energy inside of it. So if you just had a system where everything eats other things, and then this is the circle of life, right? That you have say you have you have mushrooms that grow on dead matter, and then you have a thing that eats the mushrooms, and then you have a thing that eats that, and then you have a thing that eats that, and then that thing dies and provides nutrients into the soil that the mushrooms eat, right? That system can't actually work for any length of time, because every time the energy goes from one to another, you're going to lose a little bit of it. This is due to what's called entropy. So at the bottom of every food chain, you have to have what are called the primary producers. These are things that can take energy from outside of life and turn it into energy that's inside of life. Usually, primary producers are plants, or they're some sort of photosynthetic organism. They might be a photosynthetic bacteria or archaea or something like that, but they're taking energy from the sun, and they're using that energy to fix it into a form that living things can use, like sugar. And so any ecosystem rests on the ability to get energy from someplace outside of that ecosystem in order to work. The other thing that you have to have is recycling of chemical nutrients, right? So you've got to get your energy from outside of the community because energy depletes over time. Chemical nutrients don't necessarily deplete over time, but you have to recycle them through. And so this is where you get the whole circle of life thing, right? Say you have a plant. Plants get their carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They get their minerals from the soil. You have something that eats that plant and incorporates that carbon, those minerals, all of those other components into itself. So if we have here, like we'll do this in green. We have a little plant. I studied science, not art. And then you're going to have something like a little bug. It's going to kind of like land on this and eat it. And so the nutrients go from the plant into the bug. And then you have maybe a bird. Some wings out there. And like tail feathers. Right, and so like the bird is going to eat the bug, and then the nutrients get into the bird, and then the bird dies, and it begins to decay. I don't know how to draw a dead bird, so we'll just go here. Tail, claws, a head, and a beak, and we'll go like X's for eyes. And its nutrients, as it decays, its nutrients are going to get into the soil with the help of some mushrooms or fungi that are going to help break this dead organic tissue down. And these nutrients will then be absorbed by the next growing plant. But energy, in the form of light, is going to come in from the outside and feed energy into the plants. So nutrients are all recycled in this circle, but energy flows through. You know, usually is heat. You know, the bird, as it moves around, is going to lose some heat. When it decays, it loses some heat. So energy comes into the system and then gradually leaks out, flows through. The nutrients get recycled around and around and around. And this is just a much better picture than the one that I drew. So, question for you. Which of these statements about ecosystems is true? Ecosystems retain both energy and nutrients. Ecosystems contain all of the members of a single species worldwide. Ecosystems include both living and non-living things. Or ecosystems are beyond the scope of biology. Hopefully you realize that we just spent a while talking about ecosystems, so they're not beyond the scope of biology. Ecosystems retain both energy and nutrients. Well, we just talked about this. The energy comes in and then flows through a system but comes out at various points. So you always have to have energy inputted into a system. Whereas nutrients are recycled around and around and around. So ecosystems retain nutrients, but they lose energy. So that's not true. Ecosystems consist of all of the members of a single species worldwide? No. They're restricted to a particular area. Like you could have a lake or a forest or a desert or something like that. But they aren't global. Global would be a biosphere. So ecosystems include both living and non-living things? Yes. They include both the life in an area as well as the non-living things, the nutrients, and the energy with which those living things interact. So that is the correct answer here.